Just before we start, good to see you all. And we have a visitor from Auckland, Dave Phillips, who used to live as a boy about 400 metres from here. And we've got Gary Benner doing the video, and he's also a Bay of Plenty boy. And his father used to fly Spitfires in the RAF. And there's at least one person here who, in fact, there's a couple of people here who've been to Antarctica on Hercs, and one of them flying the Herc. I did my last 4 years in the Air Force was on Hercs, and 3 of those years entailed going to Antarctica during the summer season. Start with an aviation story from a theatrical chap who lives in Tauranga, and he was, Alf Weston was involved in stage management and set design. And in 1975, he and the team were making a movie about the pioneer New Zealand aviator, Richard Pearce, and his flight in Canterbury in his home-built aircraft in 1903. And Alf told the story at the end of his talk, which I went to earlier in the year. They were on a film set on a farm just south of Christchurch. And it was, they were making the 1975 TV film about Richard Pearce, pioneer aviator. And they launched the home-built aircraft in 1903, replicating what happened in 1903. And Pearce flew it for about 50 yards and then crashed on top of a gorse hedge. And one of the other actors who was playing Pearce's farmer neighbour ran up to the gorse and shouted out to Richard Pearce, "You must realise, Richard, that nobody's ever done this before." Well, there was a short period of silence and then a great thundering noise coming overhead. And it was a Lockheed C-130 Hercules, heavily laden, departing Christchurch on the way to Antarctica. And everybody on the set burst out laughing at the irony of it all. Right, I did a total of 6 trips to Antarctica, and I put together a briefing package for those after the first year I went down there, for those that were going down in future, and part of this presentation comes from that briefing package, and more about that later on. The Air Force was very thorough with its cold weather survival training, because there was a distinct possibility that we could end up on the ice shelf after doing a forced landing, or in the valleys of the mountains this side of McMurdo Sound. That's the old ball hut above the Tasman Glacier near Mount Cook, and that's where we were based for our snow and ice survival. And after our first day out on the Tasman Glacier, we had a few drinks outside the ball hut, and the mountain parrot keas were up on the roof of the hut, squawking at us. So a couple of bright sparks decided to soak bread in whiskey, and they threw that up to the keas. Well, we didn't get much sleep that night, because the keas, after several slices of whiskey-laden bread, they couldn't fly. and they spent the whole night scrambling around on the roof. So we were practicing crevasse extraction there, getting up the rope and back out of the crevasse. That was an aviation medicine doctor in the stretcher, and we got him almost to the top, no safety rope, and the rope hauling him up snapped. So the doc ended up going down, and the bottom end of the stretcher ended up in a melt hole down, and we were worried about losing him under the glacier. That's on the Tasman Glacier. And Paul Gaisley, one of the instructors, he was a mountaineer, Air Force pilot, lifted the doc's head out of the water, and we managed to haul him out. So it ended okay, and he wasn't injured. That's up on the Ball Glacier, just above the hut, practicing building snow caves and snow trenches, which we spent some time in. 4 years later, in 1975, there was an avalanche on another team, squadron members there. The squadron lost three people plus Paul Gaisley. It's the old story of training to avoid losing people, and then when the training becomes that dangerous, you have to wonder. That's Paul Gaisley looking down a slope at him, showing how to use an ice axe to arrest your fall. That's Paul on the right. He'd already survived an avalanche where he was buried for 11 hours, and that's why he's got a glove on his hand. He'd had a bit of frostbite, but he lost his life on that second avalanche up on the Ball Glacier. On the left-hand side is Harry Ayres, a geologist who used to be in charge of the volcanoes in the central North Island. He was a pioneer Scott Base geologist and did a lot of exploring around Antarctica, and he was teaching us some of these snow skills. He went through teaching us how to abseil and gave us a great talk out there at the edge of the cliff, and the rope's hanging over, and then he was about to demonstrate it, and then somebody said to Harry, why don't you tie on the top end of your rope around the rock before you go over the edge? He'd forgotten to do it. That's Operation Deep Freeze that used to be at Christchurch Airport, and the main operators to Antarctica were the US Navy Hercules aircraft. We got a lot of help from them, including our gear. And Nigel McNeil, who's with us tonight, mentioned the Mickey Mouse boots. That's pretty old-fashioned survival gear from the Korean War. So we weren't seriously well equipped here, but there's 4 lots of pants here, the thermals, whole lot of gloves. There's a harness here for holding the gloves so that if you drop the glove you could haul it out of the snow without losing it and getting frostbite. And up the top there's a hood with wolverine fur to stop the ice forming around your head. We had a heck of a lot of help from the Americans, and we used that frequently, every season. Track would take us down over northern Victoria land. Ross Island is here. That is permanent ice the Ross Ice Shelf, and that's from freshwater ice that's slid down off the polar plateau, and it's floating on the Ross Sea. And then out from there you get sea ice, pack ice floating around certain times of the year. But our track would take us over northern Victoria land, which is this area here, and into the landing area down here. South Magnetic Pole was very close to our track, and you could actually see the wet compass turning as we flew along. We had primitive navigation equipment, no GPS. We had a Doppler system which gave us drift and ground speed, and fed into a ground position indicator. It gave you a ground position, but it was only as good as the accuracy of the Doppler. And we also had navigation, radio navigation aids, the equivalent of VOR DME, the military equivalent's TACAN, and also the radio compass. And we used shortwave radio, single sideband, HF, and no satellite phones. So it was pretty basic. And we had a sextant, and that was used a lot for looking at the sun and other astronomical bodies. See how the meridians are all gathering up close, and at the South Pole they all join in one spot. So it's not much use trying to talk about meridians of longitude. Have a look at the magnetic variation. 160 degrees, almost half a circle. So the compasses at that position were out by almost half a circle. Pretty confusing. So the answer to that was to put a grid overlay over the map, over the chart, and navigate on grid navigation and talk about grid north, which I'll come to in a moment. So you see New Zealand here, a track taking us up to across Victoria Land and on to McMurdo. There's the track. South Magnetic Pole, very close to track. And about 65 degrees south, we went from regular navigation to grid navigation. So we unlocked the heading instruments in the aircraft from the magnetic input and set them via sextant. We'd set them on grid north. But because all this was invented by people in the other hemisphere, and north of the equator, grid north was right up the Greenwich meridian. So we were flying true south, but heading grid north. It's pretty confusing. And about 65 south was our point of safe return as well. So we had to make a decision there as to whether we were continuing. Thank goodness with the new Hercs that are coming, the J model, they can fly with a bigger payload over the top of McMurdo airfield and return back to Christchurch if the weather turns to muck. So you just hope that south of 65 south that things aren't going to close in on you. Because we used to have an option in northern Victoria land of Hallett Station, and that was a joint New Zealand-American station. But the year before I started going there, the buildings burnt down. So it was a nice runway on ice in the bay, and we lost that. So the only options we had was to land in fine weather at McMurdo, or to fly on over somewhere else, up a valley or on the Ross Ice Shelf, and put the aircraft down. And then put our survival skills into operation. Typical load on the Herc. We would have a number of passengers, but mainly freight, and more stuff going south than coming north. That's pack ice on the way. Probably not as much of that now as there used to be. So polar weather, there's a whole lot of factors of interest to aviators. You've got a permanent anticyclone sitting over Antarctica, and the centre of it's about the South Pole. So high pressure, and the wind is flowing out from that anticyclone permanently. Around the outside of that anticyclone over the sea, you've got migrating low pressure areas, like the screaming 60s, and moving around quite quickly. Now, halfway between New Zealand and Antarctica, and it moves a bit, you've got the polar air mass meets the subtropical air mass. And that's where the polar front is. It's not always visible, but where the polar front is, and it moves up and down, north and south, that determines where the polar jet stream is. And the polar jet stream will be up by the tropopause, which is the boundary between our troposphere that we live in and the stratosphere above. And the thing you need to know, you aviators, is once you start flying at high level, the fastest wind flow in a jet stream is on the cold side laterally and vertically. So the polar side of the jet stream is the fastest wind, and the stratospheric side, the top side of the jet stream, is also the fastest wind. And that's of quite a bit of interest. So you do get clouds down there, but not as many. You can get layers of cloud coming in, but there's the water vapours mainly turned into ice crystals or snow particles, and it's dropping out of the sky. You don't get rain down there, obviously, and you don't get much icing when you're in flight, but you can get it when you're down near the surface. So what cools off the fastest, the sea or the land? The land, yeah. So the seawater that's closest to the land, that forms solid ice before the sea further out freezes, because the sea stays warmer. And then you've got land ice, and that's, you've got the South Pole's at over 9,000 feet, and in fact it goes down below sea level, so there's a lot of ice there, and that slowly migrates towards the coast, and ends up, you'll see an edge of the polar plateau's ice in a moment. So you get the natural anticyclonic outflow of wind from the centre of Antarctica, and on top of that, because the air's cold, it wants to flow from high level down to sea level. Katabatic wind. You've all encountered katabatic winds, I presume, you club aviators? Surface temperatures. What do you think the surface temperature at Scott Base would be?
Minus 32?
Yeah, that would be a good average. It gets, on a warm day, it gets up around minus 25. Parts of Antarctica get right down to minus 75 or even colder. Yeah, it'd be a pretty serious cold day, Scott Base, if it got to minus 75. Visibility. If you're not in cloud or fog in Antarctica, you can see for about 90 nautical miles because there's nothing in the atmosphere, no water vapour sitting up there. Clear as. And it's quite deceptive. That's a pretty important factor, is certain light conditions. The sky looks the same as the ice or the snow in front of you, and it's very confusing. In fact, you have to keep looking at your horizon instrument to know which way's up. Very confusing. And that's an even more important item is surface definition. You can have wind blowing and you've got snow or ice particles that blowing around a metre high and you can't see where you're going to put the aeroplane down. And if you combine that with no horizon definition, the whole area is white. What are you going to do? That's the meteorological term for blowing snow, BLSN. And then there were magnetic storms, which we quite often experienced. So it's all very well having high frequency long range radio, HF, but quite often we'd go for an hour, maybe 2 hours without talking to anybody because the radio waves weren't getting there, because of the ionosphere being disturbed by magnetic storms. Satellite phones would have fixed that, but we didn't have those. So that's Antarctica. That's the first look at Antarctica if you're flying south. Cape Adare. There's historic huts there. And lots of penguins and penguin poop. Some of our people would probably debate that statement. They're historic buildings and the New Zealanders have been looking after them. So there's the track that we took across Victoria Land. Cape Hallett, the one that's Cape Adare there. Cape Hallett was down here and we lost that option. So we flew across Victoria Land, down over the Ross Sea, and then the waypoint was right in the middle, that's Bird Waypoint, right in the middle of McMurdo Sound, so that the radar could see you and you could receive signals from the navigation beacons. A lot of white out there. Stratosphere, that's above our part of the atmosphere. Regularly the boundary between the troposphere and the stratosphere was at 25,000 feet, whereas in the tropics it's right up around 60,000.
How high did you go? How high did the Hercs go?
We'd be in the mid-30s, depending on how heavy we were. We'd get higher as we burnt fuel. Yeah. You can see how dark the sky is above that Herc there, because most of the atmosphere is below. So I said the sea closest to the land's first to freeze. Bay ice or fast ice. Pack ice, and that's really, mariners really get uptight about pack ice because it moves all over the place depending on the wind blowing it, and it can pack in against a ship and you can't move. That's in northern Victoria land. So flying down there with your altimeter set at 1,013 hectopascals, because the air is so dense, because it's cold, you're actually flying lower than what your altimeter, your true altitude is less than what your altimeter is telling you. That's quite a big factor. So how big's that? How are you going to measure it? There's no man-made objects to cue the eyeball in, so you really don't have any idea. That's a couple of glaciers coming down two different valleys and merging. And the expanse of the landscape and the lack of visual cues within it is a real problem. That's looking out towards South Africa. That's an Inuit word, nunataks. They're mountains that are buried in snow and ice. So there's big valleys between them. It's accumulated snow and ice. Pack ice there in the foreground, was a bit of cloud above it. Fast ice or bay ice. So what's an ice tongue? Does anyone know? It's a floating glacier. The glacier reaches the sea and it slides on out.
Bruce, did you take those pictures?
Yeah.
So it mightn't look like that now, you know, the little...
Oh, definitely not. Yeah. And for Anatole, that's the Drygalski ice tongue.
Not a bad camera for back in the day.
Yeah. I wonder what it looks like now. Tidal crack in the ice cap. So you can see the fast ice against the land. What's that stuff at the top? That's the polar ice cap, freshwater ice, sliding out towards the sea. And in between you've got a piece of land. Probably a bit easier for the icebreakers nowadays. See how the sea is refrozen around some of those pack ice particles? That's quite a distinctive visual cue on your way down the Victoria Land coast towards McMurdo, Cape Washington. That's the Drygalski ice tongue up there. Got a couple of islands north of Ross Island, and they stand out quite clearly as identifying features. And see where the track goes into the middle of, this is the established track to McMurdo, and that's Bird Waypoint there.
Where's Mount Erebus?
We'll come to that, yeah.
Isn't it on that map?
Yeah, it is there. Erebus there, yeah. Erebus, Bird. That's McMurdo here. This is all freshwater ice. The Ross ice shelf, 300 feet thick. And then this area here freezes as well, sea ice. So Scott Base and McMurdo are down this corner here. Down over here you've got Black Island, which I'll come back to later, and White Island.
So is Bird just a waypoint?
Yeah.
Is it a physical point as well, or just a flyby waypoint?
It's on in the navigation gear. It's named after Admiral Byrd, who was the first guy to fly over the South Pole. And he actually had an establishment, temporary establishment, on the other side of the, excuse me, mate.
See the one that had the beach at end, the beach stagger.
Yeah, and he was on the other side of the eastern side of the Ross Ice Shelf. Bay of Whales, he had an establishment over there. So this is approaching Ross Island from the north, Mount Erebus, and McMurdo Sound's over here. That's Beaufort Island. Oh. So you've got Cape Bird at the northern end of Ross Island, Cape Royds, then Cape Evans. Volcanic islands, so these are probably lava flows. Hut Point and Scott Bases and McMurdo Station are there. And then beyond that on the freshwater ice, the thick ice, the ice shelf is the ice runway. That's the other side of Ross Island looking out towards South America. Some of you would have read about the expedition on one of Scott's early expeditions down there to out to Cape Crozier to get some emperor penguin eggs in the middle of winter in the dark. Have any of you read that story? The most impossible journey on the earth? And then their tent blew away, but they survived it. So this is coming down McMurdo Sound, Beaufort Island, Ross Island, looking out towards South America. So Cape Bird's up here, and then you've got Cape Royds and Cape Evans, and then you've got this long lava flow that comes out of Mount Erebus, and on the end of it you've got Scott Base, and on the other side you've got McMurdo Station. So you've got the thick Ross ice shelf right round this lot. On top of the ice here you've got moraine rocks from coming down over the hills, and then in here you've got sea ice that freezes over winter and then gradually melts during summer.
How large is Ross Island compared to New Zealand's other islands and stuff like that?
It'll be about half the size of Stewart Island, probably. Yeah, that's what the moraine on top of the ice shelf looks like. Bit of a mess, you wouldn't want to land on that. So the airfields that we used, the runways we used were out here. The skiway was on, you had to have skis to use it, was on top of the thick ice shelf. And out on the saltwater ice was the ice runway that we used. Seal colonies. That's a US Navy photo. We got a lot of photos from the US Navy. Hell of a lot of help from them. And you can see the ice runway out over here. So Scott Base is over here, McMurdo Station in here, Observation Hill, and there's a vehicle track out on top of the ice out to the, there was an airfield base of tents and cabins and all that out further up. That's my photo of McMurdo Station, and you can see the fuel tanks up there. A whole lot of fuel tanks, and same down here. Pretty messy place, there's a lot of rubbish lying around the place. So there's the airfield camp up there on the permanent ice shelf, 300 feet thick. And that's the border where the sea ice starts. In the beginning of the summer season it's 12 feet thick and it melts away to 6 feet thick. And when it's down to 6 feet thick, that's when we give up going there. So why is it called Williams Field? Well, 1956, I think it was, Richard Williams was driving his D8 bulldozer along on the sea ice. And the ice gave way and Williams and his D8 dozer went through the ice and never seen again. So Williams Field. So it's a seasonal thing on the ice runway, which it's a bit like landing on a wet concrete runway. You've got reasonable braking action. Oh, I'll go back to that. Hang on. You're stuffing this up a bit. To use the skiway up the top there, you've got to have skis. So we weren't equipped for that. There's the road around to McMurdo Station, and 6 miles away was the Pegasus Ice Runway. Now the US Navy had 2 Lockheed Super Constellation passenger aircraft, and one was called Pegasus and the other one was called Phoenix. Well, Pegasus got past the point of safe return on his way down there. Weather forecast was all good. Got to Williams Field, low blowing snow. So he made 6 approaches and then decided we're running out of fuel and I better get this thing down on the ice before we run out of fuel. So he flew out on the ice shelf and dropped it down. Wing snapped off. 60 people got out alive, some minor injuries. And near there, the aircraft wreck is still there. And near there, the Americans subsequently built an ice runway on the permanent ice shelf and called it Pegasus Field. Did you ever go there, Nigel? They had trouble with Pegasus Field because south of there is Black Island, which is a volcanic island. Lots of black dust on it, hence Black Island. And in summer the black dust was blowing across on top of the runway at Pegasus. And guess what was happening? Melting the ice. So they shut that about 2016 and they built another runway about 3 miles towards South Africa from there and called it Phoenix, named it after the other constellation which didn't get wrecked. It's in a museum in the States. So Pegasus Ice Runway is where the aircraft land, the big aircraft land now. But they're still operating the sea ice runway and the skiway as well. And Phoenix runway is first time the Americans have done this. It's on solid ice, but then with rollers they've compacted the snow on top, so it's now called a white ice runway. So that's the ice runway at Williams Field. Not particularly good horizon definition, and it gets worse than that. As the season goes on, you end up with higher snowbanks either side of the runway because they're clearing snow off the runway in use. So you've got to watch out for that. Not much use spraying water on a fire if anything catches fire. All the firefighting is dry powder, and that's the fire truck. So we'd have about 2 hours on the ice there, and then we'd fly back about 7 hours to Christchurch.
What year was that, Bruce?
That would have been about 70, 73 or 72. Who was that?
I was just asking. Me.
Yeah.
Is one of those the same Hercs we're still running now?
Yeah, well, that's where I finished this this program. Over here, you've got all our survival gear: sledge, water, ropes, crampons, you name it. And survival rations, lying outside and moving stuff. That Herc's actually been grounded. It's being used for spare parts now. Spare propeller. You'll see the fuel tanks in the background there, fuel bladders. That's the New Zealanders in their sophisticated Antarctic gear, whereas our guys are walking around in Korean War cold weather gear with Mickey Mouse boots on. As you see on the left there. So that's a pants packing party. 2 Americans had gone up to Christchurch for medical reasons or whatever, might have been toothache, had overstayed their time away, and that's not viewed very sympathetically by the people that are stuck on the ice. So that guy's already had his pants filled with snow, and this guy's about to. That's an injured Kiwi arriving from Cape Bird Research Station. He'd been researching penguins, and we've done a heck of a lot of research there. Must have slipped over. He's got a broken leg. Those 2 Hercs over there, 320 and 319, the Americans at one stage were supporting cross-Antarctic expeditions by landing out in open field landings on unprepared snow on their skis. You could land all right, but then they used JATO bottles, rocket bottles, to get airborne, and they were attached at the back of the wheel wells on brackets, and the unprepared surface of the snow was so rough that during takeoff, on 2 occasions, the bottles let go and flew up through the inboard props. Hence the Herc had to drop back on the snow. And in both cases, the Hercs were buried in the snow for about 2 or 3 years, and the Americans succeeded in digging them out, fixing them, and then flying them back. But it was a real problem. It gave that idea of open field landings away. So refuelling, pretty straightforward. That's out at the camp by the airfield, Williams Field, looking back towards Mount Discovery, observation point.
Sorry, the fuel would come in on the ships, would it? And then into the tanks and then pump out the...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Everything's on skids, so it can be moved around, including the control tower, the radar, ground control approach. They could do radar approaches, and that could see aircraft approaching bird waypoint and guide them in. Fortunately, I never had to use it. Did you have that experience, Nigel? Yeah. See the aerial farm on top? That's the ridge up the back of Scott Base. Great if there's no magnetic disturbance, but as I said before, there were long periods where we didn't talk to people, which was pretty upsetting. Those flags are just marking the vehicle track on top of the ice. Fuel bladders. Over the back you can see the pastel green buildings of Scott Base. They look pretty insignificant. And where the ice shelf swells up as it freezes, it provides these lumps when it runs up against the land, lumps along the coast. So it makes it awkward getting in and out. So wind-blown scoria, lines of it there. Needless to say that McMurdo Station and Scott Base have now got wind farms to power their electricity. Did any of you know that there was a nuclear reactor down there? Unbelievable, isn't it? So that's Scott's original hut on his first expedition. And his ship got frozen in the ice, so they were stuck there for the winter. So he avoided that next time he went south. See the skua birds here, all skua gulls, all waiting for hacks. And Scott's hut.
It's quite big.
They're big, all right, and they're a real problem.
The birds, the hut.
Oh, the hut, yeah,
It's much bigger than I thought it was.
yeah. So that's at Scott Base, looking back to the airfield, Williams Field. Black Island over here. Do you recognise the historic piece of farm machinery there? Taken down there by Ed Hillary. And on the left is the aircraft hangar. They had a beaver and an oster there at one stage, and then also an otter.
Did the beaver go down in Hercules?
No, went by sea. Yeah. So that's Scott Base, the old Scott Base. They're rebuilding it now. It's all in separate units, isolated by corrugated iron tunnels, so that if you burn one hut down, you don't lose the whole lot. All anchored down by cables as well, strong winds. Christmas time. So they still had huskies there. They were more a recreational thing, but a friend of mine was a geologist down there in the late 1950s, and he travelled long distance over the northern Victoria land by dog sled. Skua gulls looking for hacks. They were a real problem at the crash site after Erebus, by the way. Drove the rescuers nuts.
What did you say they were looking for? What were the gulls looking for?
Food,
Oh, just food.
yeah. So seal blubber. They're saying down there, if you haven't got a bright green lime-coloured stain on your muckluck boot, you're not a qualified Antarctic explorer, because the huskies will pee on your boot if they know you well. Scott Base again, that's a Bombardier in the background.
Is that you, Bruce?
Yeah. Bombardier Muskeg tracked vehicle. That particular day, a group of us came directly from the Williams Field strip to Scott Base, cross country, rather than following the vehicle track. And halfway across, the driver slowed down and he stopped. And the rear end of the vehicle was sinking into snow, which had filled up a melt hole. And we thought, shit, we're going to become Dick Williams on his D8 and go through the hole. So he orders us all out and we spread out across the ice while he very carefully levered his vehicle out of the hole, and we climbed back in and went on to Scott Base, but it wasn't very pleasant.
Is that you?
Yep. Mount Erebus, see how clear it is? 35 nautical miles away. Clear as a bell. That's one of the aircraft that lost its JATO bottles and had to force land, 319. That was their newest Herc in those days, and ski and wheels, 917, similar model to ours, except it had skis. Well, they damaged the wheel landing gear on a landing out the other side of the Ross Ice Shelf, and snapped the main landing gear on the left side out of its track, and they chained it all down against the fuselage and flew back to Williams Field, and then flew it all the way back depressurised with the wheels tied into the fuselage by chains to Christchurch, and with the help of the Lockheed engineers, NAC rebuilt it. The landing gear, fixed it, and it went back to operations. And about within a year of my taking this photo, that aircraft crashed trying to land in low-blowing snow at the strip at Pole Station. The wing snapped off, the tail snapped off, and the aircraft was carrying a fuel bladder to refill Pole Station. So everybody got out alive, and the fuel bladder went out the back where the tail had been and caught fire and disappeared down through a hole in the ice, and that was the end of 917. So the US Navy's VXE-6 was a bit short of aeroplanes. Just damn glad that we didn't have to put our aircraft down on the ice. Fair bit of stuff lying around there. So we never got our aircraft fully cold soaked, like if we'd stayed for a sleepover, where there's different procedures in getting the aircraft started, but the Herc's very well set up to heat its engines before you start them. Heaters under each engine oil tank, and heaters for the whole of each engine nacelle. But the problem with the hydraulics is the rubber O-rings around the hydraulic rams shrink in the cold and leak hydraulic fluid. So how do you reckon they fix that? Somebody comes around with a hot blower and squirts hot air all over it. Fixes the problem. And if we had a cold-soaked aircraft, you've got to leave the thing running, for, the electrics running for a while to warm up before you start trying to use them. Sastrugi. Now, on one occasion, one of the US Navy Hercs went cross-country off the ice runway and through the Sastrugi, it's a Russian word, and caught fire. And that was the end of it. So they towed it out on the ice shelf. The aircraft was intact, but it was wrecked. And flying into the circuit at Williams Field, it was quite confusing with no horizon. Seeing that aircraft there and working out whether it's actually on the surface or whether it's airborne. And quite a visual illusion. That's the Royal Society range in the distance, 55 miles away. So on my last trip out of Williams Field, I decided I'd go past and have a look at the historic sites on Ross Island. Couldn't go below 1,500 feet because that was a requirement with the penguin colonies there. So you got Cape Evans, was Scott's second hut was there. He decided he wasn't going to be frozen in down here on his last expedition. Shackleton, and then Cape Bird, where the New Zealanders have done a lot of work. Can you see the hut? What do you think this coloration around here is? Penguin poo. You wouldn't want to be too close to that. Scott never went back to that hut. And his team. Okay, this is Shackleton's hut here, 1907. Shackleton got within 97 miles of the pole on that expedition, and he turned around and realised it was going to be too dangerous to continue, and he got his whole team back to their hut safely. What do you reckon the coloration is up here? You got it? Yeah, more penguin poo. And the New Zealand Antarctic Research Program has spent a lot of time preserving these two huts. Drygalski ice tongue. Probably about 100 feet high, that cliff along the edge of the ice tongue. That's the whole glacier is floating on the sea. I wonder what it looks like now. And we're heading out of there. Been a pretty long day. That's looking across to South Africa. Aurora, always green at those latitudes. And Benny, have you seen the aurora over northern Canada? Normally that colour. Answer your question? Yeah. Pretty sobering.